The gate hit the frame at 2:17 in the morning. Not a click, a slam, the kind that sends vibration through the ground and up through your spine like a warning from the earth itself. The floodlights above the yard buzzed and flickered their pale yellow wash, making everything look sick. The gravel was wet from earlier rain. The air carried rust-old concrete and something beneath both, something animal and wrong. Three men stood outside the fence. They weren't hiding. They had operated unchallenged long enough that stealth had become unnecessary. They stood in the open the way men stand when they believe consequences belong to other people. From inside the enclosure, the sound came. Low, resonant. Not a bark, nothing so manageable as a bark. The sound a living creature makes when it has been pushed past the edge of its patience into a place it did not choose and cannot exit. One of the three men laughed. Just enough. From the far end of the yard came the sound of boots dragging across wet gravel. 24 hours earlier, Roy Callahan sat in a truck that had seen better decades. The vehicle was a 1994 Ford F-150, the color of old pewter, with a crack running diagonally across the lower passenger corner of the windshield that he had been meaning to fix for 2 winters and hadn't. The engine was off. His breath fogged in the cab as he sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just resting the way a man rests his hands when he has nowhere left to go. He was 62 years old. His hair had gone fully white sometime in his late 50s, without the gradual transition other men seemed to experience. He had taken it as a kind of verdict and moved on. He was parked on the service road along the east perimeter of Fort Harlow, a K-9 training installation outside Fredericksburg, Virginia. He knew every building in there, the layout of the kennel facility, the orientation of the training fields, the squeak of the door on the equipment shed in Sector C that maintenance had been promising to fix for 6 years. He knew the smell wood shavings industrial disinfectant dog, Virginia red clay, embedded so deep it no longer registered as smell, but as orientation, like a compass reading. He had served inside those gates for 23 of his 28 years in the Army. 8 months ago, they had handed him a form and walked him out. He unfolded the paper now, though he didn't need to read it. It was a transfer notification routine on its surface. Specialist Nora Callister, 26 years old, reassigned from Fort Benning to the K-9 unit at Fort Harlow, effective the following morning. Roy had looked up when he first saw it, because he knew Nora Callister. He had trained her. 3 years ago at a facility in Kentucky, a young specialist with sharp eyes and the stillness of someone who had spent considerable time learning to make herself invisible. He had watched her work with animals for 2 days before he said anything to her directly. On the third day, he had brought her to an enclosure where a German shepherd named Rex was kenneled and had stood outside the fence with her and watched the dog move. Rex was 4 years old at the time, 91 pounds of trained wariness. Roy had raised him from 8 weeks. He knew the way Rex moved when alert, the barely perceptible elevation of the right shoulder that preceded action. He knew the sound of Rex's breathing when something was wrong before Roy himself had identified the source. He knew things about that dog that existed only between two living beings who had spent enough time together to understand each other past language. He had told Nora Rex doesn't accept handlers. 4 tried. He works the exercises follows protocol, but he doesn't connect. She had gone into the enclosure without performance. She had sat in the dirt, not protocol tactically, a significant vulnerability, and looked at the ground between her feet. Rex had moved toward her in his own time. Not quickly, not dramatically. The tentative approach, the pause, the reevaluation, the final deliberate closing of distance. He had sniffed her hair, her shoulder. He had moved around her the way weather moves around a fixed point. Then he had sat beside her. Roy had said quietly, "All right," just those 2 words. But the quality of the exhale preceding them, the slight adjustment of posture, she heard it as the recognition of something waited for and the relief of finding it. He had trained her with Rex for 6 months. He taught her the command language, not the standard protocol, but the secondary system developed over years with this specific dog, a set of signals and sounds particular to this relationship. He taught it carefully, repetitively, with the patience of someone who understood the knowledge was not easily transferable. He had told her once, he'll remember this. Dogs like him hold on to things. The person who speaks his language, he'll know. Even after time apart, he'll know. Now she was being sent to Fort Harlow, to the unit where Derek Holt was staff. Roy knew Derek Holt the way a man knows a specific kind of weather from pattern recognition built over years. Holt was 34 and had the bearing of a man who had never been genuinely challenged. Competent technically. He performed well in structured evaluations and revealed himself in the spaces between them, in how he spoke to junior personnel when no one senior was watching, in how the men around him subtly adjusted, pulling inward and going quieter, like animals recognizing a predator. Roy had filed 2 reports about Holt, both reviewed and closed without action. The second time, Colonel Warren Briggs had called him in and said in the carefully measured language institutional power uses to convey actual meaning that certain complaints reflected poorly on the person making them, rather than the person named within them. Roy had listened, thanked the colonel, walked back to his desk, and spent 45 minutes understanding what had happened and what he intended to do about it. What he had done: kept every document, made copies, stored them in places not connected to Army filing systems, methodically and without urgency, because urgency was usually the enemy of thoroughness. 8 months ago, they had handed him the form and walked him out. He had carried the copies with him. He looked at the gate of Fort Harlow in the gray November light and felt something in his chest that was not fear and not grief, but a heavy thing that lived between both of them. He folded the paper, started the truck, and sat in the running engine watching the gate. He did not drive away. Inside the facility, Nora Callister arrived at 0630 with a regulation duffel bag and a posture that communicated exactly nothing. This was intentional. She had spent years learning to communicate nothing with her posture and expression. She was by temperament observant and reactive, the kind of person who noticed things and had to prevent those noticings from showing. She had trained the skill through repetition, through attention, through doing it again when she got it wrong. The administrative sergeant processed her paperwork without looking up. Barracks C Bunk 14, Unit PT at 0700, K9 facility orientation the following morning. She found the barracks without asking directions, set her duffel on the mattress, sat beside it for 30 seconds, the amount of time she permitted herself to be still, then stood and began to understand the room. Counted exits. 2. Noted window positions, identified the personal gear on surrounding bunks, and began constructing impressions of their occupants. She was still doing this when the door opened. Derek Holt was not a large man, which surprised people sometimes. Average height, average build, the kind of physical presentation that receded into a crowd unless you knew what to look for. What you had to find was the quality of his attention, not broad spectrum awareness, but the focused attention of someone who had identified what they wanted and was calculating the approach. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have already decided about. He said Carter. She said Callister. He said right, in a tone indicating the correction was irrelevant. He was holding her transfer papers, which she had not given him. He looked at them briefly, then back at her. Fort Benning, he said. Handler. He nodded slowly. We'll see how that translates. He dropped her papers onto the bunk, not handing them, dropping them. The distinction was small and deliberate. He left. From 3 bunks down, a voice low directed at her. You don't want to end up on his bad side. She didn't turn. Noted. The voice belonged to Brendan Marsh. She would learn this within the hour. 29 unremarkable in most visible respects, possessing the alertness of someone who had survived an environment where alertness was necessary. He watched things carefully and said less than he saw. He had been at Fort Harlow 14 months, had learned to occupy the middle distance, close enough to see, far enough from the center to avoid being a target. He had been watching Holt for 6 of those 14 months. He looked at Nora's eyes when she came in, and they were not the eyes of someone afraid, which meant she was either very experienced or very foolish, and something about the deliberate quality of her stillness suggested the former. He decided to watch her. The K9 facility was in the northern section of Fort Harlow, separated from the main training grounds by a service road and a windbreak of Virginia pines planted 30 years ago for noise mitigation. The smell reached you before the building's animal and cleaning agents in metal and grain specific as a fingerprint. Nora walked the perimeter that first morning on the pretext of familiarization, a legitimate activity for a new handler, and she used the cover to walk every accessible pathway note, every camera position, identify every building and its function, locate the long-term holding enclosures in the facility's northeastern corner. The holding enclosures were set apart from the main kennels, 6 of them, 4 occupied by the ordinary sounds of kenneled dogs, the 5th empty, the 6th occupied by an animal making none of those ordinary sounds. The 6th enclosure was quiet in a way different from empty. She identified this from 20 meters and stopped walking. She stood on the path for 3 minutes. The November wind moved through the pines. From inside the 6th enclosure, once a sound. Low, brief, then nothing. She recognized it. She stood 3 more minutes, then turned and walked back toward the main facility. That evening, Marsh found her at the end of the afternoon meal. He sat across from her at the long table with a tray he mostly didn't touch, looked at the middle distance for a moment, then said at a volume requiring her to lean forward, "The dog in the northeast holding area. His name is Rex." She didn't change her expression. "He's been in that specific enclosure for 11 days, Marsh said, but the extended evaluation restricted access. No outside handler, no regular exercise that started 7 months ago right after Hess was transferred." He paused. "The 11 days is the latest phase. Restricted feeding on top of everything else. Holt called it a behavioral stimulus protocol. He said the last three words as a person says something in a language they find disgusting. The feeding restriction started when you were assigned here. I don't think that's a coincidence." She looked at her food. "Who ordered the review?" "Holt submitted the incident report. Colonel Briggs authorized the holding order." She ate a bite, put the fork down. "How long have you been watching this?" "Long enough to know you're not the first woman assigned to this unit who's been briefed on Rex within the first 48 hours. He picked up his fork and looked at his food, and his voice was as level as he could make it, but something moved underneath it like current beneath ice. "Handler named Hess, 7 months ago. Gone inside a month." He stopped. "She was good. Better than most people here knew because she didn't advertise herself. She tried to file a report." "What happened to it?" "Same thing that happens to the reports." She nodded. Around them, the mess hall noise continued undisturbed. "Amanda Hess," she said. "Amanda Hess, corporal." He looked at his food. "If you wanted to look her up." She already knew, but she let him believe she was hearing it for the first time. That night in the dark of Barracks C, Nora lay on bunk 14 and allowed herself 4 minutes somewhere other than here. She was from outside Harrisonburg, Virginia, a house too drafty in winter and too warm in summer, with a porch that wrapped around the east side where her grandmother had sat in a specific chair every evening until it got dark watching things move in the fields. Her grandmother had died when Nora was 16, and the chair had stayed on the porch for years after unmoved because moving it would have required acknowledging something the family found easier to leave unacknowledged. She thought about the chair sometimes when she needed something real. Then she thought about Rex. She had met him 3 years ago at that training facility in Kentucky. She had sat in the dirt of an enclosure and waited. And Rex had come to her in his own time and sat beside her, and Roy Callahan had stood outside the fence and said quietly, "All right." Roy had told her that Rex would remember, that the command language, the secondary system, the sounds and signals particular to this dog would register even after time apart. She had believed him then because she had seen enough to know when a person was describing something they understood rather than something they hoped. She believed him now because she had heard the sound from the sixth enclosure and she had recognized it before she let herself. She closed her eyes. At 2:17 in the morning, they came for her. The barracks lights came on simultaneously at full brightness. Not standard. She was awake before they fully engaged. 3 of them. Holt in front. Tyler Nash and Jesse Crane flanking, using the doorway in a way that was structurally similar to crowding without technically being it. Nash was Holt's age broad with the blankness of a man who had outsourced his moral judgment to someone he admired. Crane was younger, 26 or 27, with the tension of someone not certain this was a good idea, but more afraid of the alternative. "On your feet, Callister," Holt said. Other bunks were occupied. No one moved or spoke, which was itself information, not asleep but aware and conditioned. One person moved. Brendan Marsh, 3 bunks down, turned on his side. She caught it without looking. Nothing was communicated except proximity. "I see this. I am here." That was enough. More than she had expected. She stood, reached for her boots. Holt said, "Leave the boots." She left them. She registered the floor temperature through her socks and added it to her inventory of the situation, which was building into a clear picture of what was happening and what the next several minutes contained. They moved her outside. The cold was immediate and specific, low 30s with wind making it feel colder. Her feet on concrete, then wet gravel, its sharp edges felt through fabric. Her hands were bound behind her back with a zip tie, not tight enough to cut circulation, just tight enough to humiliate. She did not pull against it. She kept her breathing regular and her center of gravity low, and she scanned the environment, systematically, letting the whole picture assemble. The K9 facility was visible ahead. Floodlights on, the high-pressure sodium light that flattened shadows and made everything bright and simultaneously unclear. She could hear the pines, the gravel under boots, and beneath both of these, something else she had been hearing for 30 seconds and hadn't yet allowed herself to name. Then the smell confirmed it. Wet fur, old meat, a sharp metallic note underneath. the K9 holding area, the sixth enclosure. Holt stopped at the gate. He turned toward her with the expression of a man executing a planned sequence in expected order, not angry but patient, satisfied. "You think you belong here," he said. "First week, new assignment. You're already poking around the holding area, talking to Marsh, taking notes." He tilted his head. "You don't belong here, Callister." She looked at him without expression. Nash said something to Crane. Crane's laugh was thin and unconvincing, the laugh of someone performing participation. "This is Rex," Holt said in the precise cadence of official language used as a container. "Part of the unit's extended evaluation program. He's been assessed as unmanageable. Unpredictable. We've been trying different stimuli to evaluate his responses." "You're the stimulus," Nash said and smiled. Holt unlatched the gate with the casual study of someone who wants the animal on the other side to perceive the opening as opportunity. He pushed it inward and stepped aside. Nash's hand was at her shoulder, and then she was through the gate, and it closed behind her with a sound she felt in her sternum, metallic finality absorbed by the wet night air. From the darkness at the far end of the enclosure, the sound became directed. Toward her. The enclosure was 20 meters by 15. Packed dirt and gravel. The floodlight from outside created a pool of indirect illumination that left the far end semi-dark. Rex was there. She had known before she entered because the sound was directional, and she had been mapping it since 40 meters out. Outside the fence, Holt said, 5 seconds. That's all she gets." He said it to Nash in the tone of a man making a wager on something already decided. She did not look at them. She adjusted her weight, settling lower and more centered, to someone watching from outside, a woman simply standing, which was in fact what you become when you need to be very still and very present simultaneously. Rex moved into the light. 93 pounds, she estimated, 2 more than the last time she had seen him, which contradicted the restricted feeding, and then she understood the 2 pounds were not added weight but muscle density created by sustained high alert with no outlet. He was moving in a partial arc, keeping direct approach available while gathering information from the angle. Hackles raised, ears fully forward. His nose dropped once and came back up. He was close enough that she could see the scar tissue on his left jowl, old and white, against darker fur. She knew that scar. She knew how he had gotten it. Outside the fence, Nash was saying something. She didn't process it. She did 3 things in sequence. She tilted her head. 1 or 2 degrees left, which softened her gaze and changed the geometry of her posture relative to his, signaling something with no simple human translation that meant, "I am not a threat." She did this with her eyes as much as her neck. She lowered her weight another increment, and she spoke. Not English, not loudly. A sequence of sounds that moved through the cold air at the exact pitch and tempo at which Roy Callahan had taught them in those late afternoons in Kentucky when the light was going amber and Rex was tired from work and responding honestly without performance. She said the sounds. Rex stopped moving. Outside the fence, all sound stopped. Rex stood with his weight forward and his hackles raised and his nose working ears in the position she had cataloged 3 years ago as the position preceding recognition in this specific animal. His breathing was audible. The night was cold. The floodlights buzzed. He took 1 step, stopped. He dropped his nose to the dirt-tracked left, 3 feet, came back to center, raised his head and looked at her. Directly at her, the specific quality of attention belonging to a creature making a decision. It understands matters. She held. She did not move toward him. She let him have the time. From outside the fence, Holt said quietly, "What is she doing?" Not a question. The sound of a script that had stopped running. Rex crossed the remaining distance with the speed of resolution rather than attack. He stopped so close she could feel the heat of him against her shins. He put his nose to her knee, her hip, her bound hands. He moved his nose to her neck and she felt the moisture of it and then felt him still gathering the information, processing it in whatever way this animal processed things. She felt him exhale. Then he pressed his forehead against her sternum, and the sound from him was not a growl and was not a bark and was not any of the sounds the night had contained. It was lower and steadier. The sound of a creature that has been in the wrong place for a long time and has found without warning the thing that corrects the wrongness. From outside the fence, silence. She stood with her hands bound behind her back and Rex's weight pressed against her, and she closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Not tactical, not trained, simply what happened, then opened them. She looked straight through the bars. "His name is Rex," she said. Her voice was even. The night carried it. "And you just made a very serious mistake." Rex shifted. He turned and placed himself between her and the fence, a movement she did not signal and did not control, coming entirely from him. He sat in the dirt with his weight settled, in his eyes on the three men, and the sound he made was not loud, but present in a way that did not invite response. Outside the fence, Holt was very still. Not pale, not retreating. His expression had shifted, the expression of a man who has encountered an outcome outside his plan's parameters. Not defeat, a recalibration. Nash took a step back. Crane's hands came up involuntarily, the gesture of someone whose body communicates before the mind gives permission. Somewhere in the facility from the administrative section, the faint sound of an exterior door. Footsteps on gravel moving in this direction. She watched Holt's face through the bars. He did not look like a man who had lost. He looked like a man deciding which game to play next. And that distinction, the difference between a man who has been stopped and a man who is merely shifting approach, she felt as a specific pressure in her chest. He pulled his phone from his jacket, turned slightly, said something at a volume she couldn't reach, then put the phone away. "Open it," she said, not loud, a command. He unlatched it. She stepped out with Rex at her left leg, his shoulder against her calf. She looked at Nash, at Crane, at Holt. "Remember this," she said. The night held it. In the parking area on the service road outside Fort Harlow's east perimeter, Roy Callahan's truck sat with the engine running and the heater on for the first time that evening. His phone lit once and he read the message on it. She survived. Moving to Phase 2. He knew what Phase 2 was. He had seen it twice before. It was not physical, that was the precision of it. Phase 2 was the use of systems, the use of documentation, the accumulated weight of institutional process that, when directed by someone who understood how to direct it, could crush a person as completely as any physical force and leave far less visible trace. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. Older, the fold lines softened from handling ink, faded at the creases. He didn't unfold it. He held it. He thought about Amanda Hess, 24 years old, from somewhere in Tennessee, careful and thorough and honest in the specific way that people who have been lied to by systems tend to be honest when they find the thing they believe in. She had believed in the work, the dose, the training, the sustained relationship between handler and animal that produced trust capable of saving lives. She had not survived Phase 2. Roy put the paper back in his pocket. He reached into the console and found the secondary phone, not the one he used generally, but the one maintained specifically for this contingency through address changes in early retirement and the grinding patience of a man who had decided that thoroughness was the thing that mattered. He found a number. He dialed it. 4 rings. A woman's voice, careful, alert, even at this hour. He said, "Audrey, it's Roy Callahan. I need you to come to Fort Harlow. Bring what a warrant requires." He looked at the gate. "And bring coffee. I've been sitting out here a long time, and this is going to take a while." He ended the call, put the phone in the cup holder, and looked at the gate, and then at the dark line of pines, and then at the sky, which was beginning, very faintly, very far to the east, to suggest the possibility of morning. He sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel, and he waited. He was 62 years old. He had been waiting for 28 years. One more night was nothing. Part 2. The Weight of Old Bones. The report was filed at 0642 hours. Nora learned about it through the ambient information that moves through any closed community of people, the way water moves through soil, finding the paths of least resistance. She learned it from the silence that greeted her in the administrative building, from the way the clerk located something important on her screen when Nora approached, from the way Sergeant Paulson, perfectly civil the day before, found reason to be moving elsewhere at the precise moment she arrived. She picked up her assignment schedule and read it. One line added at the bottom in the font reserved for administrative actions: Specialist Callister N. Access to K9 holding area suspended pending review. Report to Colonel Briggs, 0900 hours. She folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket and walked out into the morning. The sky was low and flat, the color of old wool, with a northwest wind carrying real cold. She had 2 hours and 18 minutes until 0900. She used them. Roy Callahan arrived at the east gate at 0715. He had driven home at approximately 0330, slept 2 hours, showered, eaten, driven back. Canvas jacket, work pants, boots that had been resoled once and were approaching the need for a second time. He carried a thermos of his own coffee. The guard, a young private named Ellison, examined his retired military ID with the thoroughness of someone new enough that he applied it uniformly, which Roy respected. Then Ellison said politely that access for retired personnel not on official business required prior authorization from a unit commander. Roy said he understood and asked if there was a commander he could speak with. The answer came back in the language institutional refusals use when they want to convey no without saying it. Commander Briggs was unavailable. Roy thanked Private Ellison. He turned and walked to the bench along the outer perimeter wall placed 5 years ago as part of an effort to make the installation's exterior look welcoming, and he sat down on it. He put the thermos beside him. He poured coffee into the lid and held it in both hands and watched the morning traffic move through the gate. Colonel Warren Briggs was 58 years old and had the bearing of a man who had built himself carefully and maintained the construction with consistent attention. Not large, but presenting with authority that had nothing to do with size, the authority of someone who had spent decades as the highest position in every room and had settled into that posture so completely, it now operated independently of context. He looked at Nora across the desk with the expression of someone applying a framework to a situation. "You were observed in the restricted holding area on your first day," he said. "The K9 in Enclosure 6 has been formally designated Level 3 behavioral risk. Unsupervised contact with a Level 3 animal is a violation of safety protocol." "I didn't make contact. I walked the perimeter path. You were observed pausing for an extended period outside Enclosure 6. I heard a sound I hadn't heard from the other animals and stopped to assess the source." Briggs looked at her with the patience of someone who finds the responses of the person they're managing mildly interesting as obstacles, but not as challenges. "Specialist Callister, you've been at this installation for less than 48 hours. Additionally," and Briggs said, his tone shifting slightly to indicate the part he considered important, "at approximately 200 hours this morning, you were documented in unauthorized proximity to the K9 holding facility. You made contact with a Level 3 animal." He paused. "This is the behavior Sergeant Holt's report documents." Holt's report, filed at 0642, about an event Holt had engineered and executed, converted through official language into a document in which Nora was the unauthorized actor and Holt's presence at 2:17 in the morning appeared nowhere. "I'd like to read Sergeant Holt's report," she said. "That's not standard procedure at this stage. I'd like to file a response. Response procedure begins after the review period. 14 days. 14 days, long enough to establish a documentation pattern supporting a recommendation for reassignment. She had seen this shape before, not from the inside, but in the file she had read 6 weeks ago about a woman named Amanda Hess. "Is there anything else I should know about the review?" she asked. Briggs looked at a paper on his desk in the way people look at papers when they want to signal an interview is over. "Dismissed." In the corridor outside, she stopped and stood against the wall for 15 seconds and breathed. Not to compose herself to convert what had just happened from disorientation into usable information. She converted it. Then she walked back toward the administrative unit. Brendan Marsh found her at noon. He passed her in the corridor near the supply room and said without slowing, "Supply run at 1300 if you need anything from the commissary." She went to the supply room at 12:55 and waited. He came in at 1300 and closed the door and stood with his back to the shelves where he could see the door at all times. "Holt filed at 0642, he said. "I know. 14-day review." He nodded, expected. "How much do you know about Amanda Hess?" "Tell me what you know." He looked at the door. The fluorescent light made everyone look slightly unwell. "Hess arrived here 8 months ago. She was genuinely good, not just technically proficient. She had a real relationship with the animals. Holt started on her within the first week. Small things initially, the kind you can't report because each one individually is nothing." He paused. "She was sharper than people gave her credit for. She started documenting, building a case." "Did she file?" 3 weeks in, the report went to Briggs. Within 48 hours, Holt had filed a counter-report about an unauthorized incident with the K9. "Same language as what happened to you." He looked at her. "Same animal. Rex." She was quiet. "She was transferred in under 2 weeks, reassigned to Georgia. Restructuring, they said." He stopped. "She died 6 weeks after she arrived. Training incident, leading an off-leash exercise on a hillside course. She fell. Blunt force trauma." His voice had been driven flat by the weight of too much. "The investigation concluded it was an accident." Nora stood against the shelves and let all of it settle into the place in her mind where true and terrible things settle, a specific place well used with room. "Who handled the investigation?" "Installation Safety Review Board. Standard protocol for training fatalities." "Did anyone question the timing?" Marsh looked at her with the expression of someone who has asked that inside his own head enough times that hearing it from outside startles him. "I did, quietly, to myself, because I had no evidence and no standing, and I had learned the cost of having neither when you try to move against this particular arrangement. She nodded. What's Holt's relationship with Briggs? Proximate. Beyond that, I can't find the mechanism. No visible unit record connecting them before Holt's assignment here. But the way Briggs responds to Holt's reports, it's not how a colonel responds to a staff sergeant's paperwork. It's faster, cleaner. It responds when someone upstream is very interested in a specific outcome. She looked at the shelves as if considering a purchase. Rex was Amanda's before he was mine, she said. Not a question. Marsh answered it as information. Yes, 3 weeks. Whatever happened between them, she understood something about that dog that others didn't. And when she left, they moved him to extended evaluation. He's been in that enclosure for 7 months. 7 months. Rex had been in the 6th enclosure with restricted feeding and no exercise for 7 months. The arithmetic landed in her chest as something heavier than numbers. I need to see Holt's original incident report, she said, the one initiating Rex's behavioral review, 8 weeks ago. Administrative files, building 2 second floor, but building 2 second floor is not a place a specialist on disciplinary review walks through without a reason. What's on the 1st floor? Motor pool administrative office, maintenance request processing. She reached into her jacket, found a pen, wrote 3 numbers on a slip of paper from the supply shelf pad and handed it to him. My truck needs a maintenance check. Oil and tires. I need to file paperwork in the motor pool office and a counter signature from a staff member present when the maintenance issue was reported. Marsh looked at the slip of paper, then at her. You know what you're doing, he said, not a question. She didn't treat it as one. Building 2's 2nd floor smelled of paper and toner and the dusty warmth of filing systems used often but cleaned rarely. Nora moved at the pace of someone with a destination deliberate and direct, which is almost always interpreted as authorized. She found the incident file dated 8 weeks prior without difficulty. She took it to the window where the light was better, and she read it. She read it twice. Then she stood at the window and let what she had read rearrange itself in her understanding. The report described an unprovoked attack by Rex during a standard off-leash training exercise. Precise medical language about the injured handler's arm lacerations. Assessments from 2 witnesses who had been present. Cited Rex's behavioral history and recommended immediate withdrawal from active duty status. The report was thorough, well-written, filed within 6 hours of the described incident, notably fast for an event that also required transporting injured personnel to medical. The 2 listed witnesses were Tyler Nash and Jesse Crane. She put the file back exactly as found, angles and placement matched to the disruption she had created removing it. What the report had not described was the weather conditions on the date in question. She had already noted reviewing training schedules that morning for a different purpose, that there had been severe weather warnings across the region that day, thunder, lightning, sustained wind. Rex had a documented sensitivity to thunder conditions. Roy had noted it in his training records from the dog's 1st year. Known and managed, not a behavioral flaw, a characteristic requiring specific protocols during severe weather. The report described standard training conditions on a day when standard training should not have been conducted. She walked back down to the motor pool office, collected her maintenance counter signature from Brendan Marsh, thanked him, and walked out into the afternoon. The shape was clear now. Not an unprovoked attack, an animal with documented thunder sensitivity placed in an off-leash exercise during a severe weather event by handlers who knew that sensitivity, then able to report the resulting stress response as unprovoked aggression. Filed and acted upon within hours because someone with authority to act was ready to do so. She thought about what it meant to build a record against an animal that could not speak in its own defense. She felt anger and let herself feel it for one long exhale, and then she converted it. Anger was accurate information. It was also expensive. Roy Callahan ate lunch on the bench outside the East Gate. Roast beef on wheat bread, mustard, nothing complicated. He ate from the wax paper he had wrapped it in and drank coffee from the thermos lid and sat in the November cold with the patience of a man who has outlasted things before. Private Cortez had replaced Ellison at the gate. She watched Roy with the expression of someone who didn't know whether to be concerned or entertained by the civilian on the bench and had settled into watchful neutrality. Roy had been sitting there 4 hours and 20 minutes when a non-standard vehicle pulled up to the gate, a gray government sedan, a lone driver unaccompanied. Either civilian agency or senior command transport, and the alone told him something about which. The vehicle cleared the gate. Roy watched it move toward the administrative section. He noted the partial plate visible from his angle and the specific institutional gray, different from military gray in a way he understood but could not easily verbalize. He finished his coffee. He made a phone call lasting 4 minutes. When it ended, he looked at the perimeter wall and thought about what a gray government sedan in the administrative section meant in the middle of a 14-day review processes that should not by any standard procedure require a visiting vehicle of that type. Phase 2 was moving faster than he had expected. He walked to the gate. Cortez watched him approach. "I need to leave a message for Specialist Callister," he said. "Nora Callister, Barracks C." She could take a written message. Roy asked for paper and wrote 4 words in the clear, precise handwriting of someone who had spent years writing things that needed to be read accurately. "Go to the mailbox." He folded it, handed it to Cortez, thanked her, and walked back to the bench. He sat down and looked at the perimeter wall and the sky above it and the line of Virginia pines beyond the installation's northern boundary. He thought about Amanda Hess deliberately and without self-protection, which was the only way he could think about her honestly. He thought about the anonymous phone call he had received 7 months ago from a facility in Georgia, a person troubled enough to call Roy's secondary number, saying that a handler named Hess had arrived 2 weeks prior in a condition suggesting significant stress, that she had been filing paperwork continuously, that 3 days ago she had gone very quiet in the way people go quiet when they have determined that the available channels are closed and haven't yet identified what comes next. He had tried to reach her through the contact provided, had not been able to reach her. 6 days after that call, a training fatality report had crossed his desk via the informal network of retired K-9 personnel. He had read Amanda Hess's name and put the paper down and sat with it for a long time. He had been 2 weeks from filing the report that got him forced out. He had filed it anyway with full understanding of the chronology because the alternative was to have had 2 weeks of early evidence about a pattern that then killed someone and to have said nothing. He would not say nothing. He sat on the bench and thought about Nora Callister walking into that enclosure with her hands bound and the steadiness he had recognized as real, rather than performed because he had been the one to teach her what real looked like. He thought about the gray government sedan. He thought about 48 hours and what they contained. He was still sitting there when the message came back through the note had been delivered, confirmed, received. He poured another cup from the thermos and thought almost. Almost. The call came at 2100. Nora sat on a bench near the perimeter far enough from the main buildings that ambient sound didn't interfere. She used the secondary phone she had kept on her person since arriving, not the phone in her personnel file, the other one. Roy answered on the second ring. She said, "Richard Holt, Pentagon, Office of Civilian Policy Review." A pause, not uncertainty, but the sound of something sliding into a place that has been waiting for it. "That's the mechanism," Roy said. 14-day review and an accelerated outside board. They're moving faster than standard. "I know, I've been watching the gate." "What do you have?" she said. "Everything," he said, and the word carried the weight of 28 years. The original behavioral documentation from 1997, not Rex specifically, but the predecessor situation. The same pattern, different animal. The report I filed, the counter documentation. Briggs's name is on 2 of the original papers. At the time, he was a major at a different installation. I didn't know for years that he'd end up here. She listened. "Amanda Hess reached out to me 3 weeks before she was transferred," Roy said. His voice changed on her name in the controlled way that voices change when they are managing something real. "She had found the same patterns independently. She didn't know about my documentation. She was building her own case." He stopped. "I told her to wait. I told her I was close to having the right channel. 2 more weeks. Nora held the phone and said nothing. "I was wrong about the 2 weeks, Roy said. "I've been wrong about the 2 weeks for 7 months. And now you're inside and the board is accelerating, and I am done being wrong about the 2 weeks." The night was cold and clear, and the stars over Fort Harlow were hard and specific. "Audrey Voss," Nora said. "She's ready, waiting for sign-off from the duty magistrate, available tomorrow morning at 0900, which means we have until then. If Farwell requests emergency reconvening before the warrant is served, the review outcome goes into my permanent record. Anything in my permanent record can be used to challenge the validity of anything I've reported." "I know." A pause. "Rex," he said. She was quiet. "The behavioral documentation on Rex is the linchpin of their version of events. Without it, their incident report against you falls apart. Without a report that holds, the accelerated board loses its authorization basis." He stopped. "There's an audit procedure. Standard K-9 behavioral review audits requested by a veterinary officer," she said. "If a vet officer requests an audit on animal welfare grounds, the behavioral documentation becomes subject to independent review. It has to be complete and accurate before the audit is filed, which creates a procedural block. Is there a veterinary officer at Harlow who would file it? Captain Daly, Animal Health Services. She had reviewed his clinical notes forms earlier that afternoon, language exceeding what was clinically required descriptions of animal condition that were for someone reading carefully accusations in the grammar of veterinary medicine. I think so. I need to talk to him tonight. Do it, Roy said. And Nora. A pause. The documents, if Farwell moves tonight, the warrant tomorrow morning may be too late. If the documents are in the right hands tonight, they become part of the warrant application and get filed. Public record. 28 years of careful sitting becomes something that can't be taken back. She understood what he was saying. I know what I'm asking, she said. Roy Callahan was quiet for long enough that she understood the silence was not hesitation, but the sound of a man arriving at something he had been walking toward for a very long time. I'll call Audrey, he said. She'll have them by midnight. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. But something in his voice had changed, not lighter exactly, but different. The sound of a man setting down a weight he had carried long enough to forget the feeling of carrying it. She ended the call. She sat on the bench for a few more minutes in the cold and the dark, and she thought about a woman who had been careful and thorough and honest and 24 years old, who had sat in a room somewhere in Georgia and understood that the channels were closed and gone quiet while she tried to figure out what to do next. She got up. She went to find Captain Daly. Part 3. Reckoning at Fort Harlow. The audit request landed on Captain Daly's desk at 08:10 on a Tuesday. He had listened to Nora the previous evening in the Animal Health Building with the expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to say a specific thing in a specific way for a period of time that had been expensive for him. He had said, if I file this, it needs to be accurate and complete, because if it's challenged on technical grounds, it goes away and so does everything attached to it. She had said it will be. He had said, give me until morning. By 0900, the audit request had been routed to the review officer. By 0930, it had created the procedural requirements she had described to Roy. Behavioral documentation on record must be complete, accurate, and available for independent review before any administrative action connected to it could be finalized. The outside review board had been scheduled for 1400. At 10:15, Nora received notification that the board had been postponed pending resolution of the audit requirement. She read the notification at her administrative desk and did not change her expression and continued data entry for exactly 4 minutes. Then she got up and went to the head and stood at the sink with the water running and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite relief. Relief was too simple. This was the sensation of a calculated risk coming through, which was different from relief in the way that landing after a controlled fall differs from accidentally not falling. She dried her hands. She went back to her desk. The notification reached Roy's secondary phone at 10:22. He was on the bench. He had become, in 4 days across 31 cumulative hours, a fixture of the East Gate area not by force, but by the accumulation of presence long enough that the place begins to accommodate rather than resist. Private Cortez, back on gate duty that morning, had started bringing him coffee at 0800, setting it beside him without comment, and him receiving it the same way. And the arrangement had the quality of a small institution formed between strangers given the right amount of time. He read the notification, put the phone down, drank his coffee, thought about what the postponement meant and what still needed to happen in the remaining hours, and what Audrey Voss driving south somewhere on Route 1 had on the seat beside her. He had spoken to her at midnight. He had given her the documents she needed, the manila envelope, sealed, taped at the edges, heavier than its size suggested, because paper accumulated carefully over 28 years has weight exceeding its physical mass. He had held it once more before handing it through her car window, the way you handle something that has been important long enough to earn that final moment of acknowledgement. Then he had let it go. She had the warrant application ready. The magistrate was available at 0900. He thought, now it moves. Inside the wire, the postponement created a shift in the installation's weather. Nora felt it moving through the facility, not through formal communications, which were always late, but through adjustments in posture and eye contact in corridors. The subtle changes that indicate information traveling faster than official channels can contain it. Derek Holt knew by 1100. Marsh told her briefly that Holt had been in the administrative section at 10:45 with the expression of a man who has reached for something and found the shelf empty. She was aware that Holt knowing changed things. A man like Holt confronting an empty shelf did not sit down. He began looking for another shelf, and she was still hours from Audrey Voss's warrant being finalized. At 1600, Colonel Briggs called her back into his office. He was not alone. A man she hadn't seen civilian dressed the professional neutral of someone whose job involves representing institutional interests without advertising which institution. 60 perhaps, with a face communicating nothing except the habit of communicating nothing. Briggs said, "This is Mr. Farwell. He's here in connection with the review." Nora looked at Farwell, looked back at Briggs. "I'd like my legal representative present for any meeting connected to the review process." Briggs said, "This isn't a formal proceeding. If it's connected to the review, I'd like representation." Farwell looked at her with the attention of someone recalibrating. He said nothing. Briggs said, "That's your right. We can reschedule." She said, "Thank you," and stood up and walked out. In the corridor, she thought about Farwell's suit, too well cut, too civilian in its specific details for military legal. Private representation. Paid by someone who had decided the informal channels were no longer adequate. Richard Holt sending a lawyer. Which meant the audit request had done more than postpone a board. It had announced her. An announcement the next several hours were the most dangerous a structure under pressure from someone who understood it would act quickly to neutralize that pressure. She needed the warrant to arrive. The warrant was signed at 0847 the following morning. Audrey Voss received it from the duty magistrate and drove south with it on the seat beside her and Roy Callahan's manila envelope beside that. She was 51 years old, close-cropped gray hair, the economy of movement belonging to people for whom the quality of attention matters more than the volume of presence. She thought about the phone call Roy had made 3 years ago when he first briefed her on what he had and what it would take to use it. She had told him the time would come when he least expected it. He had told her he expected it every day and therefore could not be surprised. She had laughed, which was not something she did often in professional context. She thought about Amanda Hess, 24 years old, careful and honest, dead on a hillside in Georgia. She drove with the precision that 20 years of field work produces not the absence of feeling, but the capacity to contain it and act through it. She arrived at Fort Harlow at 0941. The warrant was served in Colonel Briggs's office at 0952. The formal hearing was convened at 1400 in the installations conference room, not the outside review board that had been formally suspended at 1031 following warrant service, and the discovery that the warrant's supporting documentation directly contradicted the behavioral documentation submitted in connection with the board's authorization. The formal hearing convened instead under Siwanyad jurisdiction with the efficiency of something built carefully over a long time and now executing at full capacity. Audrey Voss ran the room. She sat at the head of the conference table with a folder open in front of her and moved through the proceedings with the precision of someone who has already done the harder work and is now engaged in the formal rendering of it. Derek Holt sat on one side of the table with James Farwell beside him. Farwell was very still in the way of lawyers who have assessed a situation and found it unfavorable and are managing the response. Holt was still in a different way, the stillness of a man processing the distance between what he expected and what is happening. Tyler Nash and Jesse Crane sat with the posture of people who have understood that the structure they were standing inside has undergone a change to its foundation. Colonel Warren Briggs sat at the far end of the table. He was not the same man who had sat across from Nora 3 days ago with the expression of someone applying a framework to a situation. He was the same person physically, but the quality of his control had changed. It was effort now, visible effort, when the thing being controlled is heavier than usual. Nora sat on the other side of the table. Then the door opened. Roy Callahan walked into the conference room in his canvas jacket and work pants, and the boots that needed a second resoling, and he carried nothing except himself, which was everything he needed to carry. He sat down beside Nora without being asked and put his hands flat on the table and looked at Warren Briggs across the length of the table. Briggs looked back. Roy said nothing. He had said what he needed to say in 28 years of documents in the midnight call to Audrey Voss in the manila envelope. He sat and looked at the man who had signed the order 28 years ago that buried the first report and allowed a pattern to continue that had killed a 24-year-old woman in Georgia, and the room already contained everything he needed to say. Voss waited until the room had settled, until Holt had looked at Roy and looked away, and Briggs had looked at Roy and not looked away, and the weight of 28 years was present in the room, the way weight is present when it finally arrives at its destination. Then she looked at Nora. She said, "For the record, I want to establish the investigative basis of this proceeding." She reached into her folder and placed a single document on the table face up at the center. Specialist Nora Callister was assigned to Fort Harlow on the 1st of this month under a transfer order originating from Fort Benning. Derek Holt nodded slightly. He knew this. This was the part of the file he had read. That transfer order, Voss continued, was generated by the Criminal Investigation Division, United States Army, as part of an active undercover investigation into a pattern of misconduct, evidence fabrication, and potential criminal negligence at this installation initiated following the death of Corporal Amanda Hess. She placed her CID credentials on the table beside the document. Specialist Callister is a special agent of the CID. She has been operating in that capacity since her arrival. Every interaction, every filing, every conversation conducted in her presence during that period constitutes part of a federal investigative record. The room was absolutely still. Holt was the first to move. A single shift of weight, the involuntary physical adjustment a body makes when the ground beneath it has changed before the mind has fully caught up. He looked at Nora. He looked at her with the expression of a man running rapidly backward through a sequence of events and understanding each of them differently than he had understood them when they happened. The night at the enclosure, the bound hands, the gate slamming shut, the 5 seconds he had given her voice through the bars, his name is Rex, and you just made a very serious mistake. He had thought she meant the dog. Farwell put his hand on Holt's arm. Holt didn't look at him. He looked at Nora, who looked back at him with an expression that was not triumphant and was not cold, simply accurate. The expression of someone who has seen a thing clearly from the beginning and waited with patience and purpose for the moment that clarity could be made visible to everyone else. Roy Callahan, sitting beside her, did not change his expression. He had known since the first phone call from Audrey 3 weeks before Nora ever arrived at Fort Harlow. He had known when he stood outside an enclosure in Kentucky and watched a 26-year-old specialist sit down in the dirt and wait for a dog to make its own decision. He had understood something about the quality of stillness required for that kind of work that had nothing to do with handler certification and everything to do with the character of the person performing it. He had carried that knowledge carefully the same way he carried everything until the right moment. Briggs said nothing. He looked at the document on the table. He looked at his hands in his lap. The control holding his face in its practiced arrangement was still present, but it was effort in a way it had not been before, and the effort was visible. Voss said, "I'd like to bring the animal in." Rex walked through the conference room door at the side of a young sergeant named Proctor, who had worked with him for less than 48 hours and managed the entry with visible concentration. Rex was leashed and composed. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. He looked at the table. He looked at the people around it. His nose worked. His ears moved once slightly. Voss said, for the record, behavioral review documentation submitted by Sergeant Holt designates this animal as Level 3 risk, unmanageable, unpredictable, unsuitable for handler assignment. The documentation has been central to the administrative action pending against Special Agent Callister and to the behavioral review that has kept this animal in a restricted enclosure for 7 months. She paused. I'd like to demonstrate the evidentiary relevance of the animal's actual behavioral record. Farwell said, I object to the use of a live animal as evidentiary demonstration. Voss said, your objection is noted. She looked at Nora. Nora stood up from the table. She walked to the center of the room and stood 3 meters from Rex. She looked at him, and he looked at her with the complete attention of an animal using all of its faculties to assess the situation it is in. His ears moved once. His nose worked. She said quietly in the command language the sequence of sounds that Roy Callahan had taught her in Kentucky 3 years ago in those late amber afternoons when Rex was tired from work and responding from his actual self rather than his trained self. Sergeant Proctor felt the leash go slack in his hand. Rex walked toward Nora with a deliberate resolving quality of movement she had seen before. Not eagerness, not urgency, but a creature completing something it has determined needs completing. He walked to her and stopped at her left side and sat, with the precision and settledness of a 93-pound animal that has decided where it belongs and placed itself there. The room was silent. Voss said, Level 3, unmanageable. She said it once in the flat declarative tone of someone presenting evidence and let it sit in the air of the conference room and be absorbed by everyone in it. Nora put her left hand on Rex's head. He leaned into it, the single small movement of an animal maintaining trained composure while also doing something that had nothing to do with training. Across the table, Holt looked at Rex. His expression had arrived somewhere raw and less managed, the expression that appears when the gap between who a person believed themselves to be and what they have actually done becomes briefly unavoidably visible. It passed quickly, but it had been there. The hearing ran for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Audrey Voss moved through the evidence with the thoroughness Roy had recognized in her the first time they worked together. She moved through his documentation from 1997 through Captain Daly's audit materials and Rex's clinical records through the behavioral incident report and the weather records for the dating question through the personnel records connected to Amanda Hess and the timeline of her transfer and the investigative record of her death. She was precise and thorough and did not raise her voice and did not perform anything. Tyler Nash began cooperating at the 2-hour mark. Not dramatically in the small, specific way cooperation happens when a person has spent enough time sitting across from complete documentation that the calculation about what holding out costs versus what it returns has resolved clearly in one direction. Nash looked at Farwell, who could not advise him because Farwell represented Holt and not Nash, and then looked at Voss and asked what cooperation would mean procedurally. Voss told him. Nash looked at the folder for 30 more seconds and then began talking. Jesse Crane began cooperating 20 minutes later, following a brief recess during which he sat in the corridor and stared at the wall. He came back in and said he wanted to make a statement. His statement added what Roy's documentation and Voss's warrant investigation had not been able to establish from external evidence, alone the specific operational connection between Derek Holt and the regular communications from Richard Holt's office. The mechanics of how a senior policy advisor in the Pentagon's Office of Civilian Policy Review communicated informal guidance to a staff sergeant at a Virginia training installation without leaving a traceable chain. The specific conversations, the specific understandings, the arrangement in place since Derek Holt's arrival at Fort Harlow that had made every report Derek filed a report that moved fast and resolved in one direction. Crane said it in the flat, exhausted voice of someone who has been carrying something too long and has finally set it down, and the room received it with the attention a room gives to something that has been needed and has finally arrived. James Farwell stopped taking notes approximately 40 minutes into Nash's cooperation. He sat very still and looked at the table. Colonel Warren Briggs made no statement during the hearing. He sat at the far end of the table with his posture correct and his face in its controlled arrangement, and said at several intervals that he would be consulting independent legal counsel. He looked once at Roy Callahan. Roy looked back. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. 28 years of a man who had believed his authority was sufficient to make the things it touched permanent had arrived at a room where those things were being methodically rendered impermanent, and Roy Callahan was sitting at the side of that room with his hands flat on the table, and the look that passed between them was the look of two people at the end of a very long distance with the distance finally behind them. Briggs looked away first. The sun was low and red through the conference room windows when the hearing concluded. Formal outcomes recorded Derek Holt suspended immediately pending federal criminal investigation. Tyler Nash and Jesse Crane placed on administrative hold under cooperation agreements. Colonel Briggs suspended from command pending investigation into a pattern of conduct covering a minimum of 28 years. The behavioral designation on Rex formally vacated. The personnel file action against Special Agent Callister formally nullified, and separately recorded in the language C.I.D. proceedings used for the formal reopening of closed matters. The case of Corporal Amanda Hess training fatality Fort Stewart, Georgia would be subject to a new investigative review under federal jurisdiction. Voss closed her folder. There was one additional notation in the hearing record entered at Voss's direction. Specialist Brendan Marsh, having provided material assistance to an active federal investigation under conditions of significant personal risk, was formally commended. The commendation was a single paragraph in official language, precise, unremarkable in format. Roy Callahan, reading it later, thought it was inadequate. He also thought it was the best the institution knew how to do, which was a different thing from adequate, but was what was available, and sometimes what was available had to be enough. Marsh himself said nothing when the commendation was processed. He went back to his assigned duties. He ate his meals in the mess hall. He occupied the middle distance the way he had learned to, but something in that middle distance had changed. It was no longer the middle distance of someone surviving, but of someone who had chosen where to stand and was standing there. That distinction, Roy thought, was not a small one. The room moved through the practical motions of a proceeding ending. Roy sat for a moment after the others had stood, hands flat on the table, looking at the space in front of him, with an expression that was not triumph and not relief and not grief. Something that included all three and was larger than any of them. The expression of a person who has put something down after carrying it for a very long time and is standing without it for the first time and feeling the absence of the weight. He stood up. He walked to the door. Outside in the corridor, Nora was standing with Rex at her side. Sergeant Proctor had handed her the leash at the hearing's close without being asked, simply extended it in the recognition of an obvious truth. She was looking out the corridor window at the installation in the late afternoon light, and Rex was pressed against her left leg with the patience of an animal that finds the current moment sufficient. Roy stopped beside her. He looked out the window. The installation was unremarkable in the failing light, the standard buildings, the training grounds, the line of Virginia pines at the northern boundary. But the low red November light was doing something to it, turning everything gold at the edges, making the ordinary look like something you were meant to pay attention to. He put his hand on Rex's head. Rex leaned into it. They stood like that in the corridor, with the late light coming through the window. The three of them, and the building moved around them with its sounds and its business, and none of it touched the stillness they were standing in. 2 days later, Audrey Voss found Nora in the K9 facility. It was early morning frost on the training ground, the dogs making the communal sounds of animals ready for the day's work. Rex was in the first enclosure now, not the sixth, not the northeastern holding area, the main facility in a kennel with the dimensions and conditions his training record specified. He looked different in it. Not physically different, but differently occupied, the occupation of an animal that is in the right place and knows it. Nora was doing the morning welfare check. Voss stood at the facility entrance and watched her work for a moment. She watched the way Nora moved through the kennels, efficient, unhurried, the attention of someone doing work they believe in rather than work they are performing. She walked over. She said without preamble, "I want to talk to you about your next assignment." Nora finished noting something in the welfare log and looked up. "There's a position," Voss said. "Senior Investigator K9 Operations and Welfare, federal level. The case we've built here, the structural components, the documentation methodology, it's the basis for a broader review. There are 3 other installations with patterns worth examining. You're the right person to lead that work." Nora looked at the kennels. She looked at Rex. She said, "I appreciate what you're offering." Voss waited. "I'm going to decline," Nora said. Voss did not appear surprised. She appeared to have considered this possibility and to have some degree of agreement with it. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Voss nodded. "The handler position here is yours. I've already had the formal designation processed." She looked at Rex. "He's been waiting long enough." "He has," Nora said. Voss looked at her with the expression of someone confirming what they already understood. "She said Amanda Hess would have liked you." Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the frost on the training ground, through the facility's open end, and thought about a woman who had been careful and thorough and honest and 24 years old. And she felt the weight of that thought, which was a weight she intended to keep. Weight of that kind was not a burden, but a responsibility. And responsibility was something she knew what to do with. "I hope so," she said. Voss nodded once and walked out. On the bench outside the east gate of Fort Harlow, Roy Callahan sat with his thermos. He was wearing the same canvas jacket, the same work pants. The bench had his shape in it now from 4 days of sitting, the impression cold and pressure create in things that remember use. Private Cortez was at the gate. She brought his coffee at 0800 as she had since the second morning, setting it beside him, and he received it the same way he always did. But there was a difference this morning. The difference was that the thermos was unnecessary. He poured into the lid anyway and held it in both hands and sat with the morning, which was cold and clear, and sharp-edged with the clarity that comes after days of flat gray sky. The frost was on the ground. The pines at the northern boundary were dark and still against the pale sky. He had received the previous afternoon a formal communication from the Army. 3 paragraphs. The first described the review of his involuntary retirement determination. The second described the findings of that review. The third used the specific language that bureaucratic institutions use when acknowledging that a thing was done incorrectly, careful passive institutional, which in its careful passivity constituted an acknowledgement that had taken 28 years to arrive. He had read it in the truck, had sat with it for a while, had put it in the breast pocket of his jacket where he put things he intended to keep. He was 62 years old. He was not young and did not feel young, but he felt something he had not felt in a long time. The lightness of a person no longer carrying something they had been carrying long enough to forget they were carrying it. Not happiness exactly, though something in it was related to happiness. More like the physical sensation of a long silence finally ending. The way a room sounds different after a source of continuous noise is removed, not louder, but cleaner and more itself. The gate opened. Nora came through it with Rex. Not on duty, not in formation, not for any official purpose, simply out through the gate and into the morning, with a dog who had been in a 6 by 10 enclosure for 7 months and was now on this particular morning walking on frost-stiffened grass with his nose dropped to the ground and his whole body engaged in the specific industry of an animal that finds the world interesting and is in a situation that allows it to act on that interest freely without limit for the first time in a very long time. She sat down on the bench beside Roy. Rex moved around the bench once taking in the area, and then came to Roy's side and sat with his shoulder against Roy's knee, and Roy put his hand on Rex's head, and Rex leaned into it, and Roy sat with his hand there and his coffee in the other hand, and the cold morning around them, and the pines and the frost and the pale sky. They were quiet for a long time. It was the quiet of people who have been through something together and don't need to discuss it because they are both still inside it, and the inside of it is sufficient for now. There will be time later for other words. There will be time for everything. Roy drank his coffee. Rex exhaled slowly a long breath, and the breath made a small cloud in the cold air and dispersed. Nora said, "The formal restoration letter." Roy said, "Got it yesterday." She was quiet. He said, 28 years. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. She sat beside him and let the number exist in the morning air and be what it was, both too long and also given that it had ended exactly the right length. The length required for the documentation to be complete, for the pattern to be undeniable, for the evidence to reach all the way to where it needed to reach and hold. A crow called from the pines. The frost was beginning to melt at the edges of the training ground where the sun hit it and the wet grass caught the light and made it specific. Private Cortez came to the gate, briefly saw them, and went back inside. Roy looked at Rex sitting against his knee with his head up, now watching the training, ground the alert attention of an animal that is somewhere it intends to remain. He said, "He's home." Nora said, "He's home." Roy finished his coffee. He set the thermos lid back on the thermoses and put it beside him on the bench and sat with his hands resting on his thighs and looked at the installation he had served inside for 23 years. The buildings he knew by smell and sound and the geometry of their placement. The pines at the boundary that had been growing since before he arrived and would be growing after everyone here was gone. He thought about Amanda Hess. He would think about her for the rest of his life, not as a wound but as a weight he chose to carry, which was different, the difference between loss and responsibility. He knew what it was now because Nora had shown him without using those words, which was how things worth knowing were usually shown. He thought about a 34-year-old Roy Callahan in a building that no longer existed, watching something happen that he could not immediately stop. And he thought about the 62-year-old version of himself sitting on a bench in the morning frost. And the distance between those two people was not just time, but everything done inside the time. Every document and copy and careful act of preservation performed with the understanding that the moment of their use would eventually come, even if it came slowly. He looked at the cold November sky. He said quietly to nobody in particular, and to the morning, and to the pines, and to the 28 years, and to the woman sitting beside him, and to the Jack leaning against his knee, and to Amanda Hess, whose case was open now, and whose name was in a federal file, and who would not be reduced to a training accident on a hillside in Georgia. I spent 28 years waiting for the truth to catch up. He paused. Turns out it doesn't run on your schedule. It runs on its own. He looked at the gate. He looked at the installation. He looked at Rex, who had turned his head and was looking up at him with the complete, uncomplicated attention this animal gave to the people it had decided to give it to. But it always arrives. The morning held the words. The frost melted in the sunlight. Rex put his head back down on Roy's knee, and Roy kept his hand there, and the world was cold and clear and very quiet, and it was enough. 1 year later, Roy Callahan stood at the front of a training room at Fort Harlow. Not in uniform. Canvas jacket, work pants, the boots resold a second time in the intervening months. In front of him, 12 new K9 handler candidates between 22 and 31 years old, looking at him with the expressions of people beginning something they have not yet learned to be comfortable with. He had been invited back as civilian advisor with a formal role in the K9 handler certification program. He had taken it because the work was real, and real work was what he had always been oriented toward, and because being in that building doing that work felt correct in the way things feel correct when they are what you are actually for. Nora was at the back of the room. Rex was at her side. Roy looked at the 12 candidates and thought about what he knew and what they didn't know yet, and what it would take to give them the parts that could be transferred. Some things could not, the things earning through time and difficulty, through choosing to be thorough when thorough was expensive. But there were other things worth saying, things a person could carry into the situations they didn't yet know were coming. He put his hands on the table in front of him. You're going to learn the protocols, he said, the procedures, the handling standards. All of it is necessary and all of it is real. He paused. But the thing that will actually determine what you're capable of in this work is something the protocols don't teach. He looked at them. It's what you do when the system points the wrong direction. He let that sit, because at some point for most of you it will. And when it does, the only thing that keeps you honest is the understanding that doing the right thing is not contingent on the system cooperating. One of the candidates looked at him with the attention of someone for whom this was not abstract. He looked back. Be thorough, he said. Keep records. Document accurately. Not because documentation wins every battle, because the truth needs somewhere to live until it's ready to be used. He looked at the 12 faces. It always arrives, he said, just not on your schedule. The room was quiet with the quality of a thing received. Outside the window, the Virginia pines stood dark and still against the winter sky. The same pines, the same sky, the same cold ground, and the same installation, and the same work being done now, as when Roy Callahan first arrived here 29 years ago, carrying nothing except his experience and his intention, and the particular stubborn patience of a man who understood that some things took as long as they took, and that the correct response to that was to still be standing when they finished. He was still standing. He picked up the first document from the table and began.